Hi, everyone, and welcome to the second half of today's Authors at Google doubleheader. It's great to have Robin Wright with us today. Robin covers foreign affairs for the Washington Post, and her work has previously appeared in several other publications, including The New Yorker, The Atlantic, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, and the International Herald Tribune. She's received several awards for her work, including a National Magazine Award and the National Press Club Award. She is also the recipient of a John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation grant. In her career, she's reported from over 140 countries, and she's here today to speak about her new book, Dreams and Shadows, The Future of the Middle East. Writing about the book in the Boston Globe, Claude Marks called it a thought-provoking, eminently readable look at the current and future generation of leaders in that important, politically troubled region, a valuable addition to the bookshelf of those who want to get their arms around the political and religious conflicts that roil the Middle East. Robin will be speaking and then take questions from the audience. If you do have a question for her, please make your way to the standing mic in the aisle in the middle. After the event, she will be signing books for anyone who is interested and wants to stick around. So with that, please join me in welcoming Robin Wright to Google.
Thanks. I'm delighted to be here. At the Washington Post, we're we all love Google. You make our lives so much easier, especially when you're on a deadline. There's nothing better than having to have Google around to help you get those important facts on a deadline. I wrote this book because I've covered the Middle East now for 35 years, and I was concerned that in the aftermath of Iraq, we discovered how much we didn't know about the countries of the Middle East. And I decided it was time to kind of try to tell people what's going on inside countries. We tend to judge whether it's Egypt or Syria, Iraq, Iran, Morocco, the Palestinian Authority, all these areas in terms of what their foreign policies are, what Syria does in terms of Iraq or Lebanon or the peace process. And we weren't looking at what's going on inside the country. We knew so little about what was going on in Iraq that we made one mistake after another, including relying on a group of exiles, some of who had not been there back to Iraq since 1958. I first landed in the Middle East in 1973, the day the Fourth Middle East War broke out. I have a reputation for going to trouble spots just as trouble starts. I did not intend to cover a war, but it got to the point that my father said he wouldn't go to Bermuda on vacation with me because he was sure there'd be a coup d'etat. When I first landed in the Middle East, oil, you'll find this hard to believe, was $3.12 a barrel. Today, it hit $109 a barrel, and the price per gallon exceeds $3.12. I've seen a lot of turning points over that period. I stood in front of the U.S. Embassy in Lebanon in 1983, shortly after it had been bombed in the first suicide bombing by an Islamic extremist ever against an American target. And I watched as rescuers picked up bits of bodies and put them in small blue plastic bags to try to match them up later so that they could be buried together. Several of the people who had been in the U.S. Embassy had been my friends. This is something that hit home personally and professionally. So I began to try to look at the trend of Islamic extremism. And I went to Iran to look at the militant movements. I went years later to Afghanistan during the rule of the Taliban and the rise of al-Qaeda. I tried to track it. And I wrote one of the first books in 1985 called Sacred Rage, which traces the rise of militant Islam. There's no question that its explosive potential is going to be an enormous challenge to all of us for years, potentially decades to come. But when I went back to the Middle East and spent a year wandering around a region that I've lived in for many years and I've known so well, I also found something else had begun. And that's the dreams part of my title. It's Dreams and Shadows, because of both the good and the bad in the region. Today, I think there's the signs of the first promise to emerge in the Middle East. Almost 25 years after those first extremist attacks, there's a growing recognition in the Middle East that extremism does not provide any of the answers to the basic issues of human life that so many people are looking for, be it healthcare or education or job opportunity or political empowerment, that the extremists can destroy, can challenge the status quo, but they cannot provide a viable alternative. And so what we're beginning to see a generation after the emergence of extremism is a search for viable solutions, and many people beginning to take the initiative into their own hands. I'm normally a pessimist, and I'm not the kind who asks, is the glass half full or half empty? I'm the one who says, is there really any water in the glass at all? And so my pessimism has always paid off in the Middle East because I've always been right. I could say things are going to get worse, and they usually do. But for the first time going back, I began to see some interesting movement, some new public voices, some daring publications, increasingly noisy protests across 24 countries in the region, giving shape to a vigorous, if entirely disjointed trend. I saw it among defiant judges in Cairo and feminists in Morocco, female candidates for parliament in Kuwait, techies in Jeddah, brave businessmen in Damascus and Syria, journalists in Beirut and Casablanca. For all of them, peaceful empowerment is now the preferred means of making political decisions and producing change. The tiny minority that go out and kill have had such impact in part because before there were no other alternatives. The autocrats of the region have repressed, exiled, executed, put under house arrest many of the liberals, the Democrats, the nationalists who would, in our political system, offer an alternative. But today, because of impatience and frustration, because of the extraordinary miracles of instant media, because of information technology, and change elsewhere in the world, there are new political dynamics that have begun to sprout. In the old days, when I went to the Middle East, I would look for the clandestine cells, the members of Hezbollah, for example, as the barometer of opposition. Today, instead of looking for the mujahideen, the holy warriors who use bombs and bullets to make their case, I look for something called the Bajamahadeen. They are your counterparts. They are the people who use computers to send out a different message from the comfort of their homes. They're doing it peacefully. In my book, I tried to paint change and the many complexions of change in human terms, to go out and reach out to the people who are the ones engaging in new initiatives, in carving out new political space. Someone once said to me that the Middle East had no potential for change because there were no Lech Walenses, the leader of the Solidarity movement in Poland who helped bring down communism in Eastern Europe. So I went out looking for the Lech Walenses. Where are they? Who are they? And what are they doing? And so I thought I'd tell you about some of the people I met to illustrate what's happening in the region. One of the most inspiring to me is a young blogger in Egypt. His name is Wael Abbas. And Wael started a blog in 2004. And you have to understand that in Egypt, all the media, television, radio, and newspapers are all controlled by the government. What was so interesting is blogs created a different way of getting news and providing news. And he managed to capture on a cell phone the pictures of a detainee in police custody who was being beaten up by policemen and at one point sodomized with the end of a broomstick. He captured that on video and he put it on his blog, and it ended up on YouTube as well. It forced the government to be accountable because he got a message out there about government abuse, and the government had to turn around and prosecute 2 Egyptian policemen for flagrant human rights abuses. Wael's blog now gets between 30 and 45,000 hits a day. There are over 1,000 blogs in Egypt. That sounds small to all of you, but in Egypt, that's an extraordinary number. Virtually every regime in the Middle East is today under pressure. And they come from unusual array of sources. One of the other favorite characters in my book is a man named Riad Al Turk. Riad Al Turk is the Nelson Mandela of the Middle East. He has been imprisoned over and over and over. I saw him, well, the third time he was jailed, he was held in a room the size of an elevator shaft with no windows, no furniture, no toilet, no paper, no pencil, nothing to do, no access to anyone else. He was held in solitary confinement, no hour outside for athletic activity. He kept sane by taking the uncooked pieces of rice from his soup at night and drawing designs on the ground every day, geometric designs. And he was held that way, no contact with his family, no lawyer, no trial, no sense of how long he was going to be held ever, for 18 years. He was 68 when he came out. His children had all grown up. He'd missed their childhood, barely knew them. And what did he do? He continued to protest the totalitarian, autocratic regime of the ruling Assad family. And what happened to him? He went back to jail again. How many of us would be that brave? I saw him a few days after he was released the fourth time, now in his mid-70s, and he was still lashing out on against the government. He went on Al Jazeera and protested against the government. Another of my favorite stories in my book is about a soccer mom. Her name is Ghada Shabendour. This is a woman who'd never voted, never held a little pink voting card, never joined a party in Egypt. But courtesy of modern technology, she saw on one of the new satellite stations pictures of a group of women protesters in downtown Cairo being beaten up. And she was very upset about what she saw. The police were standing around watching as this happened, and they did nothing. And so she decided, the mother of 4 active children, had gone back to school because of her divorce. She needed a teaching certificate to get a job to help provide for the family. Didn't have much time to get engaged in anything, but she joined her first protest. And she told me a great story about how when she showed up, the woman next to her recognized that she was not a familiar face and said to her, "Do you have 100 Egyptian pounds?" And she said, "What do I need that for?" And the woman said, "For bail, of course." And she realized what she was getting herself into, the likelihood of being arrested. After her protest, she decided to go one step further, and she mobilized a group of friends. And they formed something called We're Watching You. And the U is the Egyptian government. And they decided that they were going to try to hold the government to account. And they formed a group to monitor first presidential and then parliamentary elections. They found out, never having voted before, never being engaged in politics, what constituted election fraud. They were really starting from scratch. Can you imagine having no political background at all, no experience voting, trying to figure out? International monitors were banned from Egypt from its elections, and so they were all the monitoring that took place. They started a website. They put out rules on their website. What would constitute election fraud? They had 2 cell phones, and they put the cell phones out by word of mouth. If you see anything, call us. On election day, they had no idea if anyone would show up. By the end of the day, they had over 1,000 documented cases of election fraud. It's the first time an Egyptian election had ever been monitored by an independent group. For parliamentary elections, they then hired a cameraman. One of the favorite tricks in Egypt is for the government to bus in its voters early in the day and then dispatch police and thugs out to harass voters, to discourage them from voting, particularly in polling stations where they know the opposition is strong. Well, with this cameraman, they captured pictures of how the police were harassing the voters, how the voters, determined to vote, got a ladder so they could crawl over a fence to get into the polling station to vote. The police then opened fire with tear gas and then with rubber bullets. And they got it all on film. First really documented film of election fraud in Egypt. Now, Ghada Shah Bendour, this wonderful Egyptian woman, is being invited to monitor elections in other Arab countries. They've sued the Egyptian government on corruption charges for signing the International Corruption Treaty and not following through on its obligations. Another one of my favorite characters in this book is a woman in Morocco named Fatima Mernissi, who was born in a harem. Now, not in a harem as we read in fiction. This is a family harem where many generations of women are kept on the second and third floors, not allowed to leave. The men have the first floor. They rule family life. Well, Fatima had watched her father lock the family radio in the cabinet. The women were not allowed to listen to the radio. And as a child, she was curious. So she, when her father went out, went to the hiding place, got the key, and opened the cabinet and listened to the radio. And she became very curious about the outside world. And so she pleaded with her mother, as a little girl, to please let her go to school. No female in the family had ever gone to even 1 year of school. So the mother pressured the father. The father held a family council where all the men, the grandfathers, the uncles, the male cousins, all get together and decide on a family issue. And they had decided that, in fact, she should be allowed to go to school. And this happened again and again for high school and then to college. She ended up at the Sorbonne in Paris. And then she ended up at Brandeis, where she got her PhD. And today she is the Arab world's leading feminist. And she's tackling issues of women's empowerment. She's tackling the traditions such as the veil, in many societies, which both figuratively and literally limit a woman's freedom of movement. Another one of my favorite characters is an Iranian, a cleric, who, in a society where the clerics decide everything, and one cleric has the power to veto legislation and overturn a presidential decision and reverse legislation, to veto candidates, he decided to challenge the idea of a supreme leader. And he started a newspaper and wrote editorials saying that no one should be above the law. He gave lectures throughout the country to say that supreme leaders should not have powers above anyone who was elected. He was repeatedly beaten up, sometimes hospitalized for his injuries. What makes him so interesting is that his older brother is Iran's supreme leader. So there is diversity in a lot of these societies, and not just in societies, but often within families. Another one of my favorite characters is a man named Abdul Karim Soroush, an Iranian philosopher. And one of the great challenges in the Middle East is blending the ideas of Islam and democracy. In Washington, where I live, that's one of the biggest debates. Can you actually reconcile the two? Can the Middle East actually be brought into modern societies? Abdul Karim Soroush has popularized a lot of ideas. You have to understand that Islam literally means submission, as in submission to the will of God. He argues that to be a true believer, you have to have come to your faith through your own free will. You may have embraced it because of family, environment, society, but to be a true believer yourself, you have to have come to it of your own free will. And therefore, he says, freedom precedes religion. That's a revolutionary idea in that part of the world. Again, these are, we in the West went through the Age of Enlightenment that gave birth to modern democracy. Went through the Christian Reformation that gave birth to the Age of Enlightenment and then modern democracy. It's a period of 400 years. And as a woman, I can tell you the process is not yet complete. We're asking those in the Islamic world to do both at the same time, all at once. And so it's thinkers like this who are popularizing ideas that show that there's not just one path, one way of thinking, one ruler, one idea, one ideology, that diversity is far more important, and that freedom to choose your faith or your political system is essential in the 21st century. Now, my book is also about shadows, and I'm not trying to argue that the period ahead is going to be easy. I think we probably have not yet seen the biggest extremist attacks against us, and probably not against many of our allies in the region. The dangers of change are already visible in many ways. Democracy is about differences, and they are bound to flourish once disparate societies have the freedom to speak and act as they please. In a region rife with minorities, opening up political societies also endangers deepening the rifts that freedom is meant to solve. We've seen this in Iraq very vividly. Opening up political space also does not guarantee who or what will fill it. We've seen this with the Palestinian elections and the emergence of Hamas. Because debate in the Middle East is grounded in its own experience, the face of change often will be too. And I suspect that during the transition we will see the emergence of many Islamic movements that will scare us in the West, emerging as, at least short-term, the main political idiom of opposition. But Islam is also the only major religion that offers a set of rules by which to govern society, as well as a set of spiritual beliefs. So transitions in the Middle East will probably not happen without having some kind of Islamic context. The period of change ahead is often going to be an uneven contest that will pit what I call the three crats against each other: the autocrats, the theocrats, and the democrats. And it will witness the inexperienced Democrats with almost no resources taking on the well-heeled and entrenched autocrats who have no intention of giving up power, and the emerging theocrats who believe they have a mission from God and a flock of the faithful to tap into. Nothing is going to happen easily or quickly. And I think for a long time, change is often going to look more like participatory despotism than participatory democracy. A former Jordanian foreign minister said to me that change is a future notion. The trick is putting it in the present. And as I said earlier, I think all the factors that are contributing to change, the momentum, the new stimulants, are going to create a period of potentially even greater instability in the short term. Some of the stimulants of change are also going to sometimes be difficult to control. Youth in the Middle East is one of the engines of change. In some countries, 70% of the population is 30 years old or younger. But this is the one community where you have the largest unemployed youth in the world. 1 out of every 3 has no job. The population in this part of the world has gone from 60 million in the 1930s to 415 million today, with the largest segment being young. They have great expectations of jobs and homes, education, and independence, virtually none of which the governments in the region can fully provide. So change in its agents will often produce troubling consequences. Many in the region will question, I think, whether the long-term benefits are worth the cost they have to pay along the way. For the shadows in this book, I also went to talk to the leaders of Hamas in Syria and Hezbollah in Lebanon. And it is clear that these are groups that are not willing short-term to compromise. And yet they have begun evolutions. I lived in Beirut, as I mentioned, during the beginning of the suicide bombings, and have been struck by the fact that clandestine movements have emerged from the underground, have known leadership, have decided to run for parliament, and have joined governments. That's a beginning, but they have a long way to go. I really want to make this a conversation, so I want to open up to your questions. But my last bottom line is that I think that the Middle East is obviously going to continue to spur anxiety and be our number one foreign policy concern for the next generation and potentially longer. Not always by choice, it's going to rivet the rest of us, rivet our attention. Yet, even as the Iraq War drags on and American efforts to promote democracy in the region have often been discredited, I still think the majority of people in the Middle East want the same kinds of things that we've seen elsewhere in the world, with the demise of communism in Eastern Europe and the end of military dictatorships in Latin America and minority rule and apartheid in South Africa. They are, at the end of the day, no different in terms of their aspirations. After a year of traveling back to the region, I concluded that what is most inspiring about many of the people in the region is not what dreams we have for them, but what their aspirations truly are, and the extraordinary things that they are prepared to do in order to achieve them. So I thank you very much, and I'm happy to take your questions.
I'll ask a question. So there's a debate that rages as to whether war tactics or non-war tactics are the best at, stopping extremism. And I'm wondering what you found in your studies and your entire career.
The question is, to what degree are military tactics the most effective in countering terrorism?
Right.
At the end of the day, I've always believed that the most effective tactics in fighting extremism are, one, economic, creating different alternatives, providing answers to a lot of the daily questions of life. For our own sake, distancing ourselves from some of the autocratic regimes that we've helped prop up because we need oil. I think alternative energy is, part of the answer, not all of it, but it's an element. I think education is critically important in giving people alternative to the madrasa religious educations that foster extremism. I think it's more important that we use our aid economically than to provide military training for a lot of the security forces who don't end up using it for security, regional security. They use it to prop up the regimes themselves. I think the lesson of Iraq is that military tactics don't work in creating legitimate, homegrown, democratic alternatives. In Iraq, it's costing us now $12 billion a month, and electricity is not much better than it was when we invaded in 2003, where unemployment is still very high, where insecurity is great. Our greatest success in many ways come from some of the kind of people that I found elsewhere in the region. The young sheikhs who, in places like Anbar province, the most unstable part of Iraq, have mobilized because al-Qaeda extremism had cost so many of their own. A young sheikh named Sattar, for example, famous for his Gucci sunglasses and his pearl-handled revolver, mobilized many of his fellow clerics because his father and his two brothers had been killed by al-Qaeda in order to intimidate the local sheikhs into cooperating with him, with al-Qaeda. He decided enough was enough, and instead of allowing al-Qaeda to work in Anbar province, they turned against them, started working with the United States. It's our greatest success, and again, it was not necessarily because of something we'd done, but because people had turned on al-Qaeda. They've now mobilized 90,000 people in Anbar province to serve in the military and the police to provide their own security among the Sunnis. This is the kind of step that's so important. But I don't think that our military force is ever again going to be seen as an effective tool in changing a regime in the Middle East.
I'd be interested to hear a bit about what you think of how Israel fits into all of this. And do you think that the Middle East can stabilize in the long term with Israel existing in its current form and or without any sort of compromises? And kind of where does this play into all of it? Because I hadn't heard any of that from you yet.
The short version of this question for the camera is, what role does Israel play and what place does Israel have in the midst of all this change? When I looked at what countries I wanted to go to understand what's happening in the Middle East, I opted in the end not to go to Israel because it is the most robust democracy in the Middle East, and some would argue in the world, and for a country that's about the size of Connecticut, 1,000 square miles, give or take. It has a political spectrum that is incredibly diverse. There are almost too many parties. I mean, for anyone to, as we're spoiled in the United States, we have a two-party system. It's very hard to form a coalition government. But it's a very vibrant democracy. And much of the future for Israel will be decided by these other countries and what happens in them. So I picked Egypt and Syria, two frontline countries in the Arab-Israeli conflict. Lebanon, a third frontline country. Palestinian Authority, a fourth frontline country, as well as Iran, Iraq, Morocco. I went to several Gulf countries as well, but there are no dynamics of change there. There are small steps, giving women the vote in Kuwait, allowing them to run as candidates. The Gulf is the toughest part of the region when it comes to the issue of change. It will take the longest. But in terms of Israel, there's no question, in large part because of the United States, that Israel has strong security guarantees and that it will remain an important part of our foreign policy. At the same time, it's clear that Israel's not going to have peace until there's an arrangement for a two-state solution. The tragedy of all of this is that there has been a formula on the table for a long time. It's a matter of compromises. It's not as if we don't know that there are going to be two states. With the breakup of Yugoslavia, it was a process that played out over a decade. We finally have the last, we think anyway, bit of the equation with the emergence of the independence of Kosovo. Israel will have a place in the Middle East. I don't think the Islamic world is going to be able to change that. One of the striking things, especially with my kind of history in the region, looking at it from the days that Israel was known only as the Zionist enemy. Now, the Arab League has come up with a peace formula that it's offered Israel. It's not acceptable because they're posturing for withdrawal to the 1967 boundaries. But the fact is, the Arab League has made clear that it's willing to accept and to recognize Israel's right to exist and to keep the property that for decades the Arabs claimed was Palestinian. So we've seen extraordinary change already. A lot more has to happen. But Israel is around to stay.
If no one else has a question, I have a follow-up to my first question, which was, so I definitely agree with you. Well, you know way more than I do, but it sounds very correct that, the homegrown solution is the best. I guess a follow-up to that would be the individual Islamic extremist, like that psychology and that mindset. Does that person respond best to being scared they're going to be bombed, or let me approach you and understand you and try to come to an agreement? Like on that individual level, what works best with that mindset?
The question is, what is the mindset of an Islamic extremist, and what's the best way of dealing with him by military means or by diplomatic outreach? Look, we tend to stereotype the people of the region, and there's enormous diversity. There's even diversity among extremists. But I'm often struck by the fact I've had to translate between a Saudi and a Moroccan because they don't speak the same Arabic. That you have a Saudi who wears the full-length white robe, and women wear 4 layers of veils, and yet in Lebanon, a few hundred miles away, you have men who wear Speedos and women who wear the sassiest, sexy bikini you've ever seen, and you're not likely to see many that sassy or sexy even on American beaches. And they're on the same, they're on the same beaches. They're not segregated. The same diversity is true among extremists and among Islamists. There's a real spectrum out there. There are groups like Al-Qaeda on one extreme who are willing to engage in the greatest modern atrocities, 9/11, as well as attacks in their own home countries. Then you have on the other side an Islamist party like Party of Justice and Development in Morocco that does not want Islamic law for Morocco, recognizes the king, is willing to go along with women's rights, and believes in Israel's right to exist, believes in a two-state solution. And then you have in the middle groups like Hezbollah and Hamas that still use terrorist tactics but also are running in governments, participating in elections. So there's no one formula that works for them all. But when it comes to Al-Qaeda, even within Al-Qaeda, you have the range in terms of those who've been identified, those who are thugs and misfits, others looking for an identity or have a grievance against their home government, who don't have a job. I mean, they really range. You look at those who were the suicide pilots on 9/11. Some of them have been educated in Europe, worked in Europe. This was not, they had a Western experience. So even, clearly the cultures hadn't been bridged, but it's not as if they'd been living in total isolation or in ignorance. There's no question that the United States has to take a very strong position against the likes of Al-Qaeda. There are other groups that, under certain conditions, look at Turkey, where you have an Islamist party that has won an election, but it wants to be part of the European Union. It's brought headscarves back for women, and yet it wants to bridge the gap between the West and the East. And the president and the prime minister have both been welcomed at the White House. They don't believe in violence either. They recognize, they're willing to continue recognizing Israel's right to exist. So there's, to say that, to use the term Islamist, it covers a lot of different things, and there are different ways of dealing with them. But clearly, we don't change our standards. There are international, not just American standards for recognizing who we deal with. We're not always consistent. I mean, this is where we are friends to some of the greatest autocrats in the world, and we're often attacked because we're seen as the props that keep these governments in power. I thank you very much.